Welcome to the Mail Time Podcast. I am joined today by Mannie Fabian. He is the Times of Israel military correspondent. We're here to talk about everything with the October 7th investigation, or lack thereof. Mannie, thanks so much for taking the time.
Hey, Daniel. Thanks for having me on.
We're recording this on November 17th, 2025, and it's not exactly clear what happened on October 7th. There was just this report that you published that, based on the IDF's findings, it said that some of the investigations into what actually happened on October 7th were insufficient and didn't actually cover all the necessary bases. For those of us in America who have been paying attention but don't know all the details, what can you offer about the situation and what the IDF has to now reevaluate 2 years onward?
So the army began these investigations during the war. It was under the previous chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, and he appointed like 20 or 30 commanders to all lead investigation teams into the failures of October 7th. There were these top-level investigations, they called them the general staff investigations, which looked into the, I would say, the more general aspects of the failures. And then there were sort of tactical investigations into specific battles. So there were 41 of those battle investigations. At the top level, there were four main topics. So every unit at the top level of the army investigated these four topics, and they were kind of put together. But they included the perception of Gaza and of Hamas over the past decade, the intelligence assessment of Hamas from about 2014 up until the outbreak of the war, the decision-making process on the eve of October 7th, so the night before, and then the command and control and all the orders that were given between when the war began at 6:29 a.m. on October 7th until when order was restored in all the communities near the Gaza border on October 10th. So those investigations were published earlier, I think it was about a year ago now, kind of through journalists, not officially by the army. Journalists like me, we were presented with all of these investigations, then we were able to report on them. And then when the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, entered the role at the beginning of this year, he appointed a team led by a former chief of the Southern Command to reevaluate all of the investigations and sort of give them a score to see if these investigations are even good enough to use, because the whole point of the army's own debriefs, its own investigations, is to learn from them, to be able to make changes, to be a better army in the end of the day. And what this reevaluation found is that some of these investigations are not up to the standard. They're not good enough to learn from and actually implement the lessons learned from them.
So you talk about learning from them, and my question, I understand the need to learn from them. Is there any sort of desire for people in the army to see accountability from these investigations? Say there was someone who completely was terrible at their job, or didn't do a good job, or ran away on October 7th when they should have stayed. Is there any mechanism to have any sort of accountability for anyone involved in the investigation?
I mean, it is a really good question because, under the previous chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, he, from what I understand from speaking to him, and he was not gonna, fire anybody from the military for failing on October 7th, because he himself, of course, also failed.
So why wouldn't he have just failed himself? Why wouldn't he just
So he
fired
did.
himself?
So he resigned.
No, but he resigned after. I'm saying, couldn't
Yeah,
he just
he took
easily
his time
resign?
because of the ongoing fighting and various other reasons, but eventually he did resign, along with the Southern Command Chief and the Gaza Division Chief and the Intelligence Chief. They all resigned. We're talking about more top-level commanders. But he would not rule on terminating the service of anyone beneath him because he felt like it wasn't right. The new Chief of Staff has said that he will make those personal decisions, and they're going to be based on this new evaluation of all the army's investigations. So from what I understand, the panel that sort of led this reinvestigation didn't make any recommendations on personal decisions against officers, but Eyal Zamir himself has said that he will make those decisions at a later time. What I think is more likely that will happen is when the army does a reshuffle and appoints new officers to roles, those who were involved in failures on October 7th won't be promoted and they'll finish their service. I don't think we're going to see anybody being fired from their job at this point. That there isn't really a mechanism for that, and I think that would see a bit too much backlash maybe within the military. I do know that there are some officers who are still in the military in some areas, who are definitely involved in failures on October 7th and are still in their roles or have moved to other roles. And it's a bit of a complicated situation. You also have the defense minister now getting involved in this. He wants to be the one to appoint officers, and he has delayed the appointment of certain officers who he thinks had some sort of involvement in the failures of October 7th, although it's not completely clear. So he's waiting for these investigations to be completed, and then he'll decide on promoting them or not promoting these officers.
So if I understand what you're saying correctly, there's nothing to date. There's nothing that a single officer, commander could have done prior to or on October 7th that would disqualify them from, say, receiving a pension or having any sort of disciplinary action for gross negligence, that within the scope of the investigation that the IDF has carried out to date, right? That's a fair understanding.
Yeah, right now, no decision like that has been made against officers. I mean, the chief of intelligence who resigned and the chief of the Southern Command who resigned, they resigned. They weren't terminated their service. They just left, and they still get a pension and everything. No one's being demoted or anything like that. I think it's important to still say that the investigations generally have found that the army failed, of course, and there are officers who made errors, but there wasn't anything really that would say this officer did completely the wrong thing. It's what the investigations have shown is that it's sort of been a failure that's systemic and lasting for years in the military. Mistakes that were made 10 years ago that were just continued on in the military for years and years and years. And then, one commander does it, and then the next commander makes the same decisions because the previous one as well. And the policy just stays the same. So it's very hard to blame an officer for his decisions right when the war started, because the failures didn't begin, on October 7th. They began 5 and 10 years prior.
Right. I do think there's something to be said, again, if the investigations are authentic, just looking at what was dismissed in terms of intelligence. There's been talk about Lieutenant Colonel A. I don't usually blur his name, but given that you're in Israel, I'll be respectful here of the Times of Israel and say that. But I think that there is fair questions about people that were looking at information over the course of years. I'm not talking about, I should have flanked on the eastern side of
Right.
Nahal Oz instead of the west. I'm talking bigger picture issues that weren't addressed, and that was someone's job to address them. I do think that's perhaps a different situation. Whether or not Magad of Golani Shlosh went to Nahal Oz to save his soldiers, or went to any of the kibbutzim to save the civilians, right? That's
right.
I
Exactly.
think outside the scope of what you'd be punished for, right? That's kind of in the game decision. I think it just prior to that, and I know that families have been really upset about it. People like Ayal Eshel and others who just can't understand how some of these people are still in polite society. That's and I think that they raise a fair objection. I'm not going to ask you to comment that since you deal with straight news.
I think it's important to note that you brought this up, the intelligence of Hamas's attack plans. Interestingly enough, this reinvestigation panel actually found that nobody looked into how these intelligence reports were ignored over the years. I'm sure you've heard of the Jericho's walls.
Sure.
Plan.
Just to clarify for the listener, the contention is that Jericho's wall was obtained, and then someone within, I believe it was 8200, sent it up the chain. You have Lieutenant Colonel Aleph A, who is dismissive of this, as well as other people. And then when someone even brought it all the way to Aaron Khaliva, who is the head of military intelligence, he was also not particularly engaged on it.
Pretty
and
much
it never made it all
everyone
the way
was.
to.
It was everyone was very dismissive of this. When the army first received it in 2018, these plans, they were dated back 2 years, and at that time, nobody really in the army thought that Hamas possessed the capability of it, and rightfully so. Hamas, in 2018 was not what it is and what it was in 2023. But the issue is that it has not really been fully investigated. Is from receiving that report, the army then received additional intelligence over the years and even observations of Hamas carrying out training similar to the plans that it received in 2018. And nobody made that connection. Nobody was like, well, look, we have this plan on paper that they made years ago. Now look, they're training for it. Nobody said that. Nobody brought that up. And then eventually there was new plans that were obtained that showed that Hamas was, gearing up for this, and there was no exact date on this, of course. And everyone within the chain of the intelligence was generally very dismissive of it. It was brought up in one discussion in the Southern Command in around 2022, but it was seen as one of the unlikely scenarios that would ever happen on the border. So that is something that does need to be investigated, and I think if there is, evidence to suggest that someone, was very dismissive of this, then there's no reason why they should be still in the military.
It's also very interesting if you look at Telegram. I've gone back through all the old Telegram groups, and it was out in the open.
Oh yeah,
I mean these training videos. They're driving in pickup trucks.
Yep,
right.
And,
so I just don't understand how you see that they're not so far away, and you let half your people go home on Shabbat, and you don't even take it seriously that perhaps they're training to actually do something. That's like a basic question that really hasn't been answered.
Yeah, 100%. Another big sort of, there's a big issue with the army's investigations is that it only really looks at the IDF. And one of the things that this reinvestigation panel pointed out, which is a bit of a hot topic, which is this doesn't look into the IDF's relationship and interaction with anybody else, with the police, with the Shin Bet, with the government. The army did things that the government told them to do, and they can't investigate that right now. It's only something for a wider, more encompassing, commission of inquiry of some kind. But also with the police as well. The police are supposedly conducting their own investigation, but things like the Nova Music Festival, that was under the police's responsibility because it's a civilian event. It's not really under the army's responsibility there. And
then why did Chaim Cohen have to sign off on it?
So the army needs to sign off on anything that's close to the border, right? But the approval of the for the safety of the party itself, of having bomb shelters nearby or having sirens in the area, it's all under the police. That's just the policy, right? The Homefront Command did a small little survey there. Some other officers signed off on Colonel Chaim Cohen's name. He didn't actually sign the document himself. And this is something that needs to be investigated. Yeah. So, I've published this previously, that the Nova Festival...
By the way, I'm sorry if I haven't seen... I try to read everything you put out. But so someone else forged his signature?
No, not forged, but it was, they asked him, hey, is this approved? And they said, sure. He said, sure, it's approved, and they sent it off back to the organizers and to the police without a signature, and it was just approved verbally, and then afterwards they added a stamp with his name on it, essentially. The whole process wasn't very organized. It wasn't something that was done very often.
What's the point of having a process, then?
Exactly. And so there needs to be, and there's been no investigation into what even is the process of coordinating a civilian event that both the police and the army need to approve. What's the interaction between the two? No one's investigated that. And it's not just that the Nova Party, it's everywhere, that in southern Israel on October 7th, what the police were doing. So that's just an example. Another thing is the Shin Bet. The Shin Bet was the sole operator of human intelligence sources in Gaza before October 7th. The IDF's Unit 504 intelligence unit had no intelligence sources in Gaza. They only used the intelligence sources in the West Bank and in other areas. The Shin Bet was the only one that had human sources in Gaza, and evidently they weren't very useful because they didn't provide any intelligence on what was going to happen.
And Yossi Cohen has come out and said that he lobbied for the Mossad to take that over in about 2016, I believe, and that he was rejected.
Yeah. So,
which is an interesting contention.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, that's something that needs to be looked into. Why was the Shin Bet the one responsible for all the human sources in Gaza? Why wasn't the army involved? Was the Shin Bet providing intelligence to the army? Were their systems synchronized in some sort of way? So there's so many other things that have not been investigated yet, and that's why Zamir, the new IDF chief, has said he supports a sort of an external investigation. He didn't say a state commission of inquiry or anything like that, but he said an external investigation that can look into these wider things. It's not just the army that failed on October 7th, although the failures are the army's responsibility, 100% the army's responsibility. But there are other factors that contributed to this. The Shin Bet and its intelligence sources, the police and its approval of the party, and the government telling the IDF to focus on Lebanon, for example. The main focus of the IDF was on Hezbollah and Iran and the Northern Front, and not Gaza, because the government was, going forward with this plan to appease Hamas with the work permits, allowing Palestinians to enter Israel for work. It's something that needs to be looked into, that the army can't look into now without, of course, getting into, weird spots there with the government, which, of course, is not interested in really investigating right now.
When Yoav Gallant stood on the podium on March 23rd, 2023, in the midst of the judicial reform and said, this has to stop, the enemies see division, there's threats, our enemies are going to see this and it will leave Israel prone to attack. And Herzi Halevi, I believe, agreed with him in sentiment. I think he even expressed that in some ways. What did Yoav Gallant, who was the Minister of Defense at the time, and Herzi Halevi do once they've identified that there is a potential room for an attack against Israel? What did those two men do to ensure that the risk was minimized?
This is going to shock you, but essentially nothing.
Not shocked at all.
Not shocked at all. The new investigation actually showed that it wasn't just Gallant saying this, and it wasn't just Herzi saying this. Intelligence officials warned Netanyahu and Gallant and other political officials. They sent them multiple letters saying that Israel's enemies are perceiving an internal weakness in Israeli society over the judicial reform. And that this is sort of a period of heightened tension, that something could happen, but nothing was actually done. The army did not adjust its level of alert. It did not adjust its deployments in light of these warnings. It didn't actually do anything. I do want to add that the army's probes have shown that the controversy in Israel over the judicial reforms didn't actually contribute to Hamas launching its attack. Hamas planned to launch the attack twice before in the years before, in 2022 and in early 2023.
Can I pause 1 second?
Yeah.
So that the natural conclusion from that statement is that the head of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, and the Minister of Defense were then using security threats as a way to try to thwart judicial reform?
No, necessarily, no. I think that there was this perceived threat to Israel, but there wasn't actually any decisions made in light of it.
Right, but how is that possible? If you get up there and you say there's perceived threats, we have to defend the border, there's actual military threat from bad actors that are looking to harm the state of Israel, and what you're doing is bad, but they're in the military side, right? I mean, obviously Gallant's part of Likud and was appealing, but how do you not make an adjustment if you're the military?
It's a great question. I do not have the answer to, and I don't think the army even has the answer to right now, unless they start questioning people. But the bottom line is no major changes were made. I think mainly because there was no sort of timing on these threats. It was just a general sort of perception thing of this is what Israel's enemies are now thinking of Israel, and it wasn't even Hamas focused. It was mainly Hezbollah focused, and this was sort of the feeling at the time. There wasn't concrete intelligence that Hezbollah was planning to launch an attack over this, and like I said, it's important to say Hamas was planning to launch its October 7th attack in early 2023 and a year prior in around September 2022. There's intelligence that proves this. There's documents the army recovered in Gaza. They were ready to launch it, and they didn't for various reasons. So it's not like the judicial reform was the reason for them launching the attack, but still, it's a huge, failure that the army did not make any adjustments to its deployment in light of these, what appeared to be very severe warnings, at least at the time.
I mean, it's severe enough that you get up in front of the entire country and say it. I just don't understand if you say that there's a huge warning, red alert, and we don't necessarily have to get into this, but I've seen what was going on the northern border after October 7th as well. It's not like they were actually ready for Hezbollah either. So the readiness aspect is really suspect. When you're sitting in the room hearing these presentations, does your gut tell you that these are thorough investigations? Does your gut tell you that you're seeing the truth?
Look, I think so. I mean, a lot of work was put into these investigations, and I've spoken to a lot of the officers who conducted them. And even the new reinvestigation, the panel found that the officers were acting, truthfully. They weren't acting with malice. They weren't trying to cover anything up or anything like that. The issues is 5 of them were sort of declared, of these 25 top investigations, 5 were sort of listed as red, or they're basically unacceptable. But it's more of a technical thing, and I'll sort of explain. So some of them are because they didn't have any findings and conclusions in them. So, for example, the Navy's investigation, it's a great investigation. It's got the entire timeline. It's got all the details of exactly what happened on the morning of October 7th, how they managed to shoot down several of these speedboats that infiltrated, etc. It's got the whole timeline. It doesn't have any findings and conclusions, so you can't exactly implement any lessons when there's no conclusions being made. So they've sent the Navy back to then basically redo this investigation.
It's kind of ridiculous, though, because
Yeah.
you're basically saying you're never going to have a circumstance just like this again. So what lesson are you actually looking for?
There are lessons you can implement from these adjustments to deployment. It's a tactical investigation, though, but there are changes you can make to your intelligence gathering, to your deployment, the fighting techniques. There's all sorts of things that they can take from it, but they didn't actually write anything. And other issues like the operations division, which is responsible for sort of allocating forces to different areas. So how many troops go to which area and which front, and times for deploying forces, etc. Their investigation as well, it was problematic for 2 reasons. One is the officer who did the investigation, according to this new reinvestigation, was not, I would say, senior enough to sort of have the experience to conduct such a wide investigation, something that's quite complicated to do. And because of that, the actual investigation itself was not really professional, up to the standard that the IDF wanted. And the other second reason why it was considered unacceptable is because it begins at 6:29 a.m. on October 7th, which means to say it doesn't look into any of the prior processes in the operations division, and I think they conducted beforehand their preparations, nothing. So they've appointed another commander to now do an investigation of everything before October 7th in the operations division, and then they'll combine them together and reevaluate it and put it back together. There's a few like this. Like I said, 5, which are basically problematic because they're either missing some very key parts or they need to be redone. There are another 10 which they call them orange, basically a traffic light. And these are missing certain things that just need to be added, and then they'll be able to draw lessons from them. But there's a few sort of like this where, they had a good investigation, there's a good foundation for it, but there's like, one of the questions that they asked is just not good enough, or they needed to ask some other question in sort of the investigation to actually reach better conclusions, and something that the army can actually learn from, because that's ultimately what it is. The army doesn't really publish these to the public as is. It does them via reporters by presenting it to them, because in the end of the day, these investigations are meant for the army themselves. They're meant to investigate themselves so that they can do better and learn from them. It's not really what many, at least according to polls, most of the public wants is some sort of state commission of inquiry, or some sort of commission of inquiry that can look into the wider aspects of it and also investigate the IDF itself.
It's fascinating because the way that you're now describing the investigations, it makes sense why so many of the bereaved families would be so angry about the investigations, because if your son or daughter was burned alive, I don't think you really care about the tactical conclusion
Exactly.
of what the IDF is saying they can benefit and learn for another Pluga in 3 years.
Yeah,
It makes
exactly.
sense why, if you're sitting there saying, my daughter, he found 2 teeth in my daughter, how did this happen? And this is the kind of investigation that's being done, be very angry. So now this is helpful in
Yeah.
understanding why there's such visceral anger towards some of these investigations, because just listening to them, it's not, it's an investigation in a very narrow scope.
Yeah, it's very narrow. They're all very narrow, and it's essentially only focused on the IDF, and many of them are just tactical investigations. What troops went, to which area. I've looked through dozens of these battle investigations, and they're detailed by every 30 seconds.
How
The
many
sort
hours have you spent hearing these investigations?
way too many, way too many. The top level investigations that the army presented us, the general staff ones, the 4 main topics, that was a 16 or 17 hour presentation. It took 2 days for me to
Straight.
go through.
Oh my God. Wow.
No, it was 12 hours one day and like 4 or 5 hours the next day. And that was just that. And then each battle investigation, there's 41 of them, and each one takes about 3-4 hours to get through.
Oh
So
my God.
do the math. It's a ton.
So
And
I have a few. I have
yeah.
a few kind of not rapid fire, but
Go for
questions
it.
that the internet people are trying to take advantage of, and I've had a little bit of insight into them just talking to so many soldiers. But the Hannibal Directive. What's your conclusion and
Right.
understanding of how the Hannibal Directive was used on October 7th?
So the Hannibal Directive was sort of revoked officially by the army several years ago. I think it was 2018, but someone correct me if I'm wrong here. There were cases on October 7th where soldiers, sometimes a platoon commander ordered his soldiers to shoot on other troops or on efforts by Hamas to return to Gaza, even at the risk of harming hostages. There were cases like that. I would say isolated cases like that. There was later on in the morning, the Air Force was instructed by Air Force Chief Tom Ibarra to bomb the border and prevent anyone from coming in or going back. I wouldn't say even at the risk of hostages, because at that point most of the hostages had already been taken and been taken back to Gaza. So there was only one identified case of a hostage being killed by Israeli Air Force fire. Efrat Katz, I believe her name was, an Air Force helicopter fired on a Hamas pickup truck, killing I think 6 or 7 terrorists inside, along with one hostage. The Air Force, the helicopter operators had no idea that a hostage was inside. So there wasn't a general protocol that went out to everyone saying shoot anything going back to Gaza. It wasn't something that the Air Force did later on in the morning, and in some isolated cases with troops shooting to try and prevent their comrades from being abducted. But again, the actual Hannibal directive is something that the army revoked previously. It's not even conducted, at least officially.
Right, and I think don't forget, there's a lot of reservists that showed up. Who knows how much attention was paid to certain, whether it was revoked or not, and there's different instances. But obviously the anti-Israel crowd is trying to spin something as if this was going around and that was the majority of people that were killed. And obviously in a war zone, you're going to have, unfortunately, friendly fire incidents.
And there are definitely cases. I don't have the exact number on me right now, but there are, at least a dozen or more cases of Israeli civilians being killed during October 7th by other IDF forces, misidentifications or shooting towards terrorists and hitting Israeli civilians, all sorts of cases. But there wasn't sort of this, as many anti-Israel activists try to claim, that most of those who were killed on October 7th were by Israel. That's just not true.
Absolutely. My next question is, this kind of went viral because certain commentators who listen to a lot of pro-Israel media have this false perception about how the IDF looked before October 7th. They don't really understand a distinction between, say, the Mossad and the IDF ground forces. Was there any aspect of an inside job that is found in any of these reports?
No, none. There was nothing like that in any of the investigations. No one collaborating, nothing of the sort. The troops on the border were completely surprised by what happened. The commanders in the division and the command, even up to the chief of staff, um, no one knew anything of what was going to happen. Everyone was surprised in the military. So there was no inside planning or some sort of inside job, and nothing of the sort.
And I'm assuming that the Army spent considerable effort looking into that, because given the scale of the failure, it would only make sense, if you have a conspiratorial mind, that maybe something was going on. How is it possible that all these things happened? And that's why, certainly after October 7th and the weeks that followed, you had all sorts of people saying, oh, it had to be an inside job. There's no way. But you're telling me that the Army, I'm guessing, looked into it, and there's absolutely no evidence that any of that existed.
They looked into it, and they found essentially that it was them being blind rather than some sort of inside job. All the intelligence was there. They just had to put the puzzle together. On the night, there were these various signs that were received, these indicative signs, and different parts of the army saw different things. Nobody was looking at the whole picture together. So one part of the army saw movement at this Hamas position, and another part of the army saw movement at another place, and the Shin Bet saw these SIM cards that were turning on, these Israeli SIM cards. But none of it was really put together, and the reason why none of it was put together is because of this whole, what they call the conception, which was Hamas is not going to attack Israel. They have no interest in war. That was the thinking of all these officers. And they all went with this line of Hamas has no reason to attack Israel. And therefore, they dismissed all of these signs throughout the night. So it's more of the army being blind to what Hamas was doing rather than some sort of inside job.
How prevalent was the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war across the entire battlefield on October 7th?
We have seen, reports come out of sexual violence during the October 7th attack. There's been several cases that have been officially reported. There's a big problem is that a lot of these victims are now dead and are unable to come forward. But we do have evidence. Israel has evidence from Hamas terrorists who have even admitted to it on camera while being interrogated, and provided details, and Israel was able to investigate it. But the main thing now, this isn't actually being investigated by the army. The police is actually leading this investigation into those crimes on October 7th, to be able to conduct actual trials for all the terrorists that were captured. Not too many of them, around 160 were captured on October 7th, to be able to essentially try them in court. So that's something the police is leading, but there were cases both in the kibbutzim and at the Nova Music Festival during the attack.
Unfortunately, the reason I'm asking this is and I've written about this, there's been certain cases of people just inventing things out of thin air for whatever reason, and it certainly complicates the narrative. Unfortunately, even Sheryl Sandberg had someone say that there were women tied to trees and all these things, and there's no evidence of that.
Yeah, look, there's enough horrors on October 7th. You don't really need to invent any stories. Unfortunately, there were a lot of these cases of people saying, I don't want to say inventing, but yeah, essentially inventing some sort of story.
I say inventing. You're saying something that
that didn't happen.
Thematically true, that you have barbarians coming through doing crazy things.
Exactly.
And you're thematically taking that and making it 17 steps crazier, but believable enough that in the midst of everything going on,
when everything was all chaotic, people were believing it. And then, within a week or two, people realized that a lot of those stories were not correct. But there is really enough terrible things that happened. That is more than enough.
And again, the reason I asked you this is because I think that the truth was so horrendous all around. The truth has to rise to the forefront, and it's very important, as I see it sitting in America, that when the conversation is going on online and people are speaking to elected officials in America, whatever it might be, that there's an adherence to accuracy in what's going on, because it's really it's problematic when essentially people that are trying to that genuinely love and support Israel are forced to defend some of these just insane stories that have
Yeah.
absolutely no basis in reality, and it takes everything away from the actual cases that are being
Yep.
put forward. Does these army investigations, where do they stop? They stop October 10th or 11th?
Yeah, October 10th. That's when control was regained over most of the kibbutzim and the highways in southern Israel. There were, of course,
Except the 3 soldiers got ambushed on
yeah,
October 11th, right?
there are a handful of cases that went beyond the 10th, so those battle investigations do go into those. And there are even cases on the 12th and on the 13th as well, in a few, but generally it's between the 7th and the 10th, and that's the sort of scope of it. Another sort of question is, when is the army going to investigate the war itself, the ground offensive in Gaza? Loads of mistakes were made during the ground offensive, tactical ones as well, but also general policy ones, like leaving areas of Gaza to allow Hamas to regain control of those areas. The army hasn't investigated that yet, and Zamir hasn't even decided on that yet. But I think eventually, perhaps when the war is officially declared over, the army will then launch a process of investigating the war itself, how it operated in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Iran, everywhere else that it
And I'm
had to
not
operate.
going to ask you to comment on this part, but I'll just say it. Zamir was also the head of the Ministry of Defense. So you also have a natural question: is how were soldiers being issued vests from 1968, 1973, and helmets from 1978, 1979, 1980 that clearly don't work? How are soldiers being sent into Gaza without gun scopes? How are soldiers being sent into Gaza with ripped uniforms? And that's one of the fundamental challenges is going to be that Eyal Zamir was kind of in charge of some of this stuff, and now he's the head of the army, and it's not a personal indictment, but
no,
like there. And I'm not going to ask you to get in trouble about this, but I'm just going to say that there's a lot of conflict of interest here when it comes to some of these investigations.
Without a doubt, but I think that even in Zamir's case, and I think in a lot of other officers' case, you can't just dismiss everyone from the military because they all have a little part in the failures, because then the army would have no officers left at the top level.
No, but I do think you can say there has to be an honest criticism. I'm okay if someone stands up and says, listen, I messed up. I endangered your sons and daughters by sending them into Gaza with helmets from 1978. That was a failure on our part, and we need to do better. If someone comes up and says that,
yeah,
I'm with them all the way, but I haven't seen that.
Yeah. That's why I do think that something external is required, because the army's investigations are really for the IDF. It's not for anybody else, really. And something external. Even right now, we have the state controller. He does all these investigations all the time into various topics, not just the military, but he's done some on the military as well. I think that's also great. It's important work that someone external is looking into the army and questioning the army. But there needs to be something more encompassing that can really address these issues.
Before I let you go, what is the craziest thing you learned from these investigations? If you had to say one story or one conclusion from all of these days worth of investigations you've listened into, what sticks out in your mind as the absolute craziest?
There are some, I would say, in the tactical investigations, some incredible stories of bravery by troops some who just arrived there, after hearing about what was happening, some who were stationed there already. I think we're going to hear a lot more about this, in the coming year when the war officially is declared over and they start giving out citations to soldiers. But there are some really just incredible stories of bravery. And when I'm presented with these tactical investigations, you really see the minute by minute play of what happened. Just some unbelievable things. Just as an example, at the Zikim base. It's a base for trainees in the Homefront Command. These are not really combat trainees, so they don't all have guns. These new rookies in the military, and one of these soldiers managed to basically disarm a terrorist who was armed with a gun with his hands. Just fought him hand-to-hand combat and managed to take his gun, and another soldier then shot him, which is just, that really kind of blew my mind. What has really shocked me the most was looking at the Jericho's walls plans and the actual intelligence reports that the army wrote up from them, and just looking at them and just, I mean, seeing them in order, from 2018 to 2022, just looking through the list and be like, how did they not put this together? Like, how did the army not raise all the alarm bells and look at these reports and say, look, Hamas is preparing to launch a major ground attack against Israel. Why was this not prioritized? That, I think, was one of the more shocking things to me.
Oh, and actually, before I let you go, I had one more question, which you just reminded me of. All these work permits, people coming into to Israel from Gaza, I think it was something close to 30,000. What is the evidence that contributed to their human intelligence gathering of southern Israel? Did that play a major role in Hamas's success?
It's possible, but I don't want to say definitively, because I haven't really seen in any of the IDF's investigations them stating that as a fact, mainly because, again, that's more of a Shin Bet thing, because the Shin Bet approves who enters Israel for work permits, and it's not something that the army is really responsible for issuing the permits. Definitely, it's the Defense Ministry, it's COGAT, the Coordinator of Government Activities, and the Shin Bet then screens them, so it kind of lies with them, so it doesn't really lie with the army. But I think potentially there is a possibility that some of these Palestinians who entered Israel with work permits took a photo of the border crossing or of the entrance to a kibbutz and passed it on to someone in Hamas, or maybe they have a family member in Hamas who then used those photos to then prepare
maybe they were in
for the
Hamas.
attack. Maybe themselves were in Hamas, exactly. It's very possible, but it's not something the army has investigated or is even able to investigate now, because it doesn't have access to those sort of lists, because that's with COGAT and with the Shin Bet. And again, that's one of the big problems with the IDF's investigations, is they're completely internal with nothing else around it.
Mannie, Fabian, I greatly appreciate you helping clarify this massive mess to the English-speaking audience. If there's anything I've taken away from our conversation, is that it is a mess, and
yes,
there's a lot of work to be done to actually understand the scope of the failure, what happened, and how these lessons are actionable. And just those IDF investigations are completely separate investigation to actually understand how Israel found itself in that situation. So I really appreciate you taking the time so that the audience can best understand that. You can find Mannie on Times of Israel. Times of Israel is a daily podcast. And I hope that, Mannie, you come back more so we could keep getting the inside scoop. Thanks so much.
thank you.